Ever pondered whether Paul's writings were influenced by his culture? It's a question that has intrigued, puzzled, and even sparked debates among scholars for centuries. Common belief suggests that Paul's personal feelings and cultural influences may have tinged his epistles. But is there more to this narrative than meets the eye? Could Paul's writings be a divine proclamation, untainted by Pharisaic bias or cultural traditions? Let's delve deeper into Paul's background to unravel the truth. To understand the influence on Paul's writings, we first need to comprehend his background. Delving into Paul's past, we find that he was associated with Pharisaism, which was the strictest sect of Hebrew culture. However, it's crucial to note that Paul's relationship with this sect was not one of blind adherence. On the contrary, Paul often issued stern warnings against the dangers of traditions that were deeply rooted in Pharisaism. He staunchly denied the Pharisaic belief in a bodily resurrection for the wicked, a departure from what was widely accepted at that time. Even more notably, he resisted the teaching that Gentiles needed to be circumcised for salvation, a stance that was a significant departure from the norm. And let's not forget his rejection of the Pharisees' separatist philosophy, an ideology that was deeply ingrained in the culture of the time. In examining Paul's background, we observe no traces of Pharisaic bias in his actions or beliefs. His life and teachings seem to be guided not by the cultural norms of his time, but by the Spirit of God. So, Paul's background doesn't seem to show any significant cultural influence. But what about his writings? Paul's writings have been subject to myriad interpretations. Let's dissect them for cultural influences. Now, if we delve into the crux of Paul's teachings, we find a profound resistance to certain cultural norms of his time. One such example is his stance on the issue of circumcision for Gentiles. It was a common belief in that era that Gentiles needed to be circumcised to achieve salvation. However, Paul disputed this, arguing that salvation was not a matter of physical rites, but of faith. This robust opposition to a widely accepted cultural norm points to a lack of cultural influence on his writings. Moving on, let's consider Paul's attitude towards the Pharisees' separatist philosophy. The Pharisees were a strict sect of Hebrew culture, known for their stringent adherence to traditions and laws. They believed in maintaining a clear divide between themselves and those they deemed unclean. But Paul, in his writings, rejected this separatist philosophy. He advocated for inclusivity, breaking down the barriers between Jews and Gentiles. Once again, we see a divergence from prevalent cultural norms, underscoring the absence of cultural bias in his teachings. If we examine these instances, it becomes clear that Paul's writings were not merely a product of his time and culture, but were shaped by something more potent: his profound faith and his commitment to the message he believed was divinely received. From what we see, Paul's writings seem to be more influenced by divine wisdom than cultural norms. So, were Paul's writings influenced by his culture? The evidence points to a resounding no. Let's revisit the main points we've covered in this exploration. We delved into Paul's background, examining his upbringing, education, and the cultural context in which he lived. We discovered that despite being raised in a society steeped in Pharisaic values, the strictest sect of Hebrew culture, Paul was not swayed by these influences. He stood firm against traditional norms that clashed with his faith, rejecting Pharisaic beliefs such as the necessity of circumcision for salvation and the bodily resurrection for the wicked. Instead, he advocated a message of inclusivity and spiritual salvation open to all, Gentile and Jew alike. We then turned our attention to Paul's writings themselves, meticulously analyzing the content, context, and tone of his epistles. What emerged was a picture not of a man influenced by his culture, but of a man guided by a higher power. His words were not colored by his personal feelings or cultural biases, but were instead a reflection of divine revelations. He claimed his message was received directly from Jesus Christ, and his writings bear testament to this claim. So, in conclusion, it is clear that Paul's writings were not dictated by the cultural norms of his time, but were instead controlled by the Spirit of God. His words were a vessel for divine wisdom, a conduit through which the teachings of Jesus Christ were propagated. They were not tainted by personal bias or cultural influence, but were a pure reflection of divine truth. Now, it's important to remember that this is not a universally accepted viewpoint. Some critics argue that Paul's writings were indeed influenced by his culture, colored by his personal feelings and experiences. However, this claim largely rests on subjective speculation and lacks substantial supporting data. Remember, the idea that the New Testament documents are tainted with irrelevant cultural matters is subjective speculation without supporting data. Until next time, keep pondering these intriguing questions.